You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Monster House presents.
Monster Talk is proud to be a part of the Airwave Media family, home of such shows as Fork in the Road, Small Things Often, and Therapist Uncensored. If you'd like to advertise on this show, contact sales at advertisecast.com. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the Satyricon by Petronius. Now, this story dates from the end of the 1st century, but I think you'll find it pretty familiar to the modern ear. A man named Trimalchio, who was a freed slave who'd made a big success of himself, he's hosting a party, and most of the guests are other freed slaves. Trimalchio complains that Nekaros, who's normally quite entertaining, is being too quiet. And so Nekaros tells a strange story. Now, he thinks that other guests at the party are going to laugh, but he swears the story is true and that it took place years ago when he was still in a state of servitude. It seems that he had fallen in love with the wife of an innkeeper, and her name was Melissa of Tarentum. Fortune had it that her husband died, and Nekaros decides that he needs to rush to her side while he has the best chance to beat out any other suitors. But then things turn quite odd. I seized my opportunity and persuaded a guest in our house to come with me as far as the 5th milestone. He was a soldier and as brave as hell. So we trotted off about cockcrow. The moon shone like high noon. We got amongst the tombstones, and my man went aside to look at the epitaphs, and I sat down with my heart full of song and began to count the graves. Then, when I looked around at my friend, he had stripped himself and put all his clothes by the roadside. My heart was in my mouth, but I stood like a dead man. He made a ring of water around his clothes and suddenly turned into a wolf. But please do not think I'm joking. I would not lie about this for any fortune in the world. But as I was saying, after he had turned into a wolf, he began to howl and he ran off into the woods. At first, I hardly knew where I was, and then I went to take up his clothes, but they had all turned to stone. No one could be nearer dead with terror than I was. But I drew my sword and went slaying shadows all the way till I came to my love's house. I went in like a corpse and nearly gave up the ghost. The sweat ran down my legs. My eyes were dull. I could hardly be revived. My dear Melissa was surprised at my being out so late and said, "If you had come earlier, you might have at least helped us. A wolf got into the house and worried all our sheep and let their blood like a butcher. But he did not make fools of us, even though he got off, for our slave made a hole in his neck with a spear." When I heard this, I could not keep my eyes shut any longer. But at break of day, I rushed back to my master Gaius's house like a defrauded publican, and when I came to the place where the clothes had been turned to stone, I found nothing but a pool of blood. But when I reached home, my soldier was lying in bed like an ox, with a doctor looking after his neck. I realized that he was a werewolf, and I could never sit down to a meal with him afterward, not if you had killed me first. Other people may think what they like about this, but may all your guardian angels punish me if I am lying.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
This week we're talking with Dr. Tanika Koosmen about ancient werewolves. I try to spread my monster love across the entire monster spectrum, but werewolves definitely rank among my most favored monster topics. So I was excited to dig in on a bit of deep history of stories about people being transformed into wolves. Ancient history is fragmentary because we don't have a contiguous body of text going back into deep antiquity. For most of human history, oral transmission was how stories were kept alive, and while spoken stories are very entertaining, they are as ephemeral as a moth's fart. So studying the scattered fragments of human history and finding stories about werewolves and then trying to figure out not just what they say, but where they existed in the cultural framework of their historical context is a challenge. But it's the sort of challenge that can really turn on the mind of an obsessed researcher, says an obsessed researcher. I'll put links to Tanika's work in the show notes, so be sure and check those out. And at one point, we do talk briefly about the idea of wild or feral children, and it turns out that this topic will be coming up on another Monster House podcast, the In Research of show that I do with Jeb Card. As we alluded to in this episode, the romantic idea of children raised by animals seems to hide a much darker story that's less about altruistic wildlife and more about parents unable to deal with kids with challenges and impairments. We may dig into that further, but I can attest that the folklore is far more fun than the reality. But this is an episode about werewolves, and it is packed full of fun information, so let's dive in.
Monster Talk.
Okay, this week on Monster Talk, we're welcoming Dr. Tanika Koosmen. All right, Dr. Koosmen's academic research specializes in the development of the man-to-wolf metamorphic tradition in the Greco-Roman corpus and its impact on modern werewolf fiction. Her research delves into the symbolic meanings behind transformation, examining how evolving concepts of human and non-human influence the depiction of werewolves in folklore, fiction, and history. Her research interests span folklore studies, post-humanism, and changing perspectives on the body in the modern world, and she's currently a casual academic at the University of Newcastle in Australia. So welcome to Monster Talk.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is going to be fantastic.
So, Tanika, we should probably start with how you got interested in werewolves. And I have to say, I'm very jealous of your PhD topic. What a fantastic subject to devote a PhD to. So, how did you get interested in werewolves enough to tackle them academically?
Oh, goodness. Well, I took a fantastic course as an undergraduate student at the same institution that I'm currently working at even. And we sort of talked a little bit through some of these sort of changing myths and myths of transformation and how the body adapts and adjusts in all of these like ancient Greek and a few Latin mythological structures as well. So I ended up getting very obsessed with this ancient text called Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is so many different episodes of transformation. And I was writing my honours thesis after my undergraduate degree was finished on Ovid's Metamorphoses, and the amount of sort of different ways that women in particular were being utilised as all of these different sort of warning stories and all of these stories about power. But I got so invested in this one episode, the tyrant king Lycaon, who is the very first transformation of a human being in the entire Metamorphoses, right after all the cosmological stuff about the creation of the universe. And I wanted to know so badly why it was a werewolf transformation that was the very first human being being transformed in this entire book about all of this historical and mythological material. And I just got so obsessed with this one story, it really expanded from there. I wanted to see how this specific type of transformation was being used in all these different kind of genres of writing. And that was where the obsession truly started.
I can imagine that happening. There's just so much material there. But I've always had a question. Maybe I'm jumping the gun too much with this. But was the king transformed into a werewolf, or was he transformed into a wolf?
Oh, this is my favorite question. The difference is all down to this idea of, so in theory and in sort of philosophical inquiry, we talk about something called the human-animal binary. And the difference between humans and animals and how those boundaries are really drawn. And a lot of the time in the ancient material, you find that this binary is being developed, so it doesn't have a lot of strict boundaries just yet. So the way we approach a lot of transformation material, especially coming from a contemporary era where we have all of these really cool werewolf stories that have a tendency to show the werewolf in much the same as that sort of there's a human being and then there's a monster. It's two parts of the same whole. But a lot of the time it's kind of dichotomy. sort of thing. It's a binary. There's two pieces. But when you get to the ancient material, when you travel all the way back there, there's not a lot of that binary thinking. So for Lycaon in particular, in a couple of his different literary appearances, they talk about the fact that Lycaon's transformation came because he was already a wolf, if not in form, then in function and in action. And behavior. So Ovid's in particular is such a beautiful myth to put together. But it talks a little bit right at the end afterwards that he's still got his sort of human mind within him, because that was always the monstrous part of him. That was always the animalistic part of him, was that he was the wolf, because they never really have creatures or people or gods or any sort of beings in these ancient mythological structures that have different forms as opposed to their mind sort of thing. So while he might have transformed into a wolf, it is like a big, hulking, proper, monstrous kind of wolf that they describe. It is a werewolf in the sense, I think, that we take from the contemporary, from the modern era, where he really is that sort of werewolf figure.
Okay, I see. So now that I've leapt forward, could we possibly backtrack, and could I ask you to just summarize the myth, because some of our listeners might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll stick to Ovid's version of events, because they can be just a little bit varied in between ancient sources, especially.
Sure. So
the king Lycaon is one of the first human beings, one of the really early Arcadian human settlements in this sort of mythological structure. And he is a king who has many, many sons and this big old family. And when Jupiter or Zeus comes down from the heavens and wants to test humankind and see if they're the kind of beings that can inherit this sort of worship of the gods, if they're good people and if they deserve to sort of inherit the earth this way, he comes down and he sends signs to the people, these sort of omens and little like divine sightings and stuff like that. And he's in his disguise as an old man, and he wanders into this kingdom, and all the people start to pray and worship for Jupiter to be walking among them. And Lycaon gets maybe a little too big for his britches and tells everybody, no, there can't possibly be a god walking among us. I know best. I am your king. And he decides that instead of providing offerings and being pious in the way that the gods expect of their kings, he's going to test the god in disguise. And so what he does is he violates quite a few of the laws of Xenia, so the laws of hospitality that Jupiter is in charge of. And instead of offering the god in disguise at a feast, he slaughters a hostage, a protected person's, and cooks the corpse and offers that for the feast for this god in disguise. And Jupiter is very, very, very unhappy about this. He decides this is the trigger point for Ovid's version of events, especially. This is the point in which he decides that humanity cannot be saved and they must be rebuilt and recreated. So Ovid razes the kingdom to the ground. He kills all of Lycaon's sons and he transforms Lycaon into this huge, hulking, monstrous wolf. Is punishment for not knowing and for not following the rules that he should have followed.
Does he get redemption later?
It would have been nice, I think, to bring him back into the story. But Lycaon's story especially is one of those really special things that weaves in and out of a lot of different ancient texts. So he comes up quite often. There's a few constellation myths that concern him, because one of his children was supposedly the nymph Callisto, who is transformed into a bear later on. So she has a whole different mythic cycle, but she has links back to Lycaon as the daughter of Lycaon sort of thing. And Plato in particular, so he writes political, philosophical texts, all of this fun sort of stuff. And Plato is one of the earliest references to, literary references at least, to the Lycaon myth cycle. And he actually mentions Lycaon in this teeny tiny little paragraph on tyrants and tyrant leaders. And he doesn't even mention him by name. He just says the tyrant will consume their people like the the king of Arcadia did to his people. So there's all these tiny little references, and to a classic scholar or someone who's familiar with ancient history, means that there was this huge oral tradition where people knew exactly what Plato was talking about just by that one little line. And we might not have it recorded in its sort of ancient form, the way that they knew the story. And we have to piece it together from all these little bits and pieces from the literature later on.
Gotcha. So there's no official canon of the classics, I guess. So the reason I found your work was because I'm obviously obsessed with werewolves, as listeners will know. But we talk about all kinds of monsters, but I really have spent a lot of time really doing a lot of research on this topic. And I came across an article that you had published on The Conversation about the ancient history of werewolves. And I thought, oh, here's someone working from the oldest stories forward, and I'm working from modern stuff backwards. This is really great. We can kind of meet and somehow still exclude the middle. But I thought maybe we could walk through some of the history of werewolves. So I would like to ask you about, what is the oldest werewolf story we've got preserved in text or imagery that you've come across so far?
So it can be a little difficult for us as classicists, and knowing full well that there's material that didn't necessarily survive all the way to the modern day. There's a really cool reference all the way back in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the little story of that Gilgamesh tells in response to the goddess Ishtar and her apparent proposition to Gilgamesh. One of my favorite parts of that text is the fact that the things that Ishtar offers to Gilgamesh are actually a sort of reflection of their funerary rites. So Gilgamesh's rejection of the goddess is on the basis of the fact that she's told him, oh, all these lovely things will happen to you. And he's said, oh, wait a second, that's what we do when people die. So are you going to kill me? And he goes, okay, how am I going to get out of this? And he starts listing all of the things that she's done to her lovers in the past. And one of those is that poor shepherd who worshipped the goddess so well, and she still transformed him into a wolf to be chased around by his hunting dogs. Such a delightful little reference. And it's definitely the earliest one that we have for wolf-specific transformation, I'd say.
It's for Game of Thrones readers, it's the Ramsay Bolton finish, right?
Oh, they do adapt it quite well.
Yeah.
And do we see versions of this story in other cultures at all, or is this a completely unique tale?
This one in particular seems to me to be fairly unique, in part because it's such a small reference too. It does sort of almost have echoes in a couple of later stories that talk about there's one specific narrative written by, I believe it is Petronius, in the 1st century AD, in the Satyricon, which is actually it's a book on satire. It's quite literally a satirical story. But he has this great little folkloric story about a man who walks through a cemetery with a soldier and is terrified when the soldier starts tearing his clothes off and transforms into a wolf under, and this might be one of the first instances where we see the connection to the full moon, is because it's as the moon is as it is on high noon. So this little tiny one, this little tiny story that doesn't get repeated anywhere else. It's this sort of folkloric, more personal or domestic kind of story. And that werewolf in particular is discovered because he hunts after a pack of sheep and the locals stab him in the neck as the wolf. And that wound is transferred to him when he transforms back into a human, and they discover that man is the werewolf because he has a wound on his neck, just as to the wolf.
Right.
It is. That is such a classic motif of all the werewolf lore and a lot of the witch lore that comes up in medieval times. Yeah. Yep. No, absolutely. Now, we lost Gilgamesh for thousands of years, but the idea of a werewolf didn't die out. So where does it pop up next? Is it Greek, I guess, next, and then Roman, or how does that flow?
So definitely Greek, first and foremost. The really interesting part about werewolves, I think in Greek culture, ancient Greek culture specifically, is that edge of animality, that animal sort of inheritance that the werewolf has, means that it's so often associated with monstrous races that exist outside of the Greek borders. So in particular, in the Greek literary history, one of the next ones we have is from Herodotus in the Histories. And this is Herodotus is sometimes called the father of history. He sits down and he says, I'm going to write about historical events, and then manages to include a whole bunch of mythical material as well. But he's the first one to do it, so I suppose it's a little practice involved in taking it all out. But Herodotus's story concerns a tribe of people called the Nurians, who exist in the sort of Black Sea region, that they're absolutely really convinced has got a whole host of monstrous races that exist beyond these borders. And the Nurians in particular are men who transform into a wolf for a couple of days out of the year. And this teeny tiny little reference to these sort of nomadic people that exist to the north is couched in all of these really cool descriptions of all of these monstrous races that occur, these people that might have human flesh included in all of their feasts, or who have like strange customs and weird rituals and stuff like that. And it might signify to us a sort of further connection into Baltic mythology and like sort of that huge Siberian region that had wolves to contend with as actual predators. So the likelihood of folding that into their folkloric beliefs and sort of religious structures is so much higher when they have that interaction in person with the wolves.
So we get werewolves in both Roman and Greek mythology, but did both cultures look at werewolves the same way, or did they have different beliefs, or was there a lot of crossover between the two mythologies?
There is a bit of crossover. I think fundamentally the Roman mythological structure does inherit quite a bit from the Greeks, and a lot of those attitudes tend to get sort of mixed in together. It's interesting to see when we do have the instances where these sort of little stories that might be more concerning to, say, Greek culture that had more interaction with people and those monstrous races like the Scythians, and then when that specific myth might be adapted into a Roman text, it's interesting to see the way that interaction might change or might stay the same for us. And a lot of the times it does stay the same, which is an interesting thing given Rome's own association with wolves. It's a whole different angle on it. Like their founding narratives, their founding myth is evolved.
Yeah, what was the founding myth?
So Rome's founding myth is centered around the brothers Romulus and Remus, and their birth story specifically. So is so held under prophecy. So the prophecy is that these children will not be kind to the line of inheritance specific to their, I believe it's their grandfather. So the birth of the children, who are apparently, they are born to Rhea Silvia. I might be mispronouncing that. It's been a while since I've gone back over my Roman founding myth.
She won't mind.
Let's cross our fingers. Yes. So she is put into a cult for protection, effectively. So the Vestal Virgins, she is introduced to this specific worship practice in order to keep her away from men, so she can't have children ever, and they can't usurp their grandfather, and prophecy solved. But as it goes, that never really solves anything in the ancient stories. And Mars, or Ares, if we're going with the Greek name, comes down from the heavens and still manages to impregnate Rhea Silvia with the children that inevitably fulfill the prophecy, but they are still in danger for it. So they're abandoned by a river and rescued by a she-wolf who feeds them and nourishes them and makes sure that they still survive to adulthood in order to fulfill the promises. And there's lots of nonsense that happens in between, and the founding of Rome is so inherently, there's such a big mythic cycle, so much information involved in it. But when Romulus murders his brother, Remus, and establishes establishes Rome, they still carry that wolf imagery. It's so inherent in their image going forward. So it's surprising for especially academics that look through these sort of like history of images and the way that this iconography is adopted. It's so interesting to see the Romans repeating folklore that might insist that the werewolf is this sort of like monstrous creature or their animal, or sometimes it's an inherently like foreign connection, these people who are not Roman or who are not Greek, and sort of see that involved in a culture that is so obsessed with the wolf imagery beyond the specific transformation context.
So narratively, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to hop into the idea of these are stories about people turning into wolves, but why or how they turn into wolves, whether it's on purpose, which seems to be really common in by the Middle Ages, or whether it's as a curse, which was in the source material, that seems to get changed. So like ultimately you come out in the 20th century with the werewolf is a curse is the primary narrative, but they also, I guess in the 20th century, a lot of people want to turn it to being a superhero because they look at all the advantages werewolves have over humans and they're like, oh, this is awesome. But it's also kind of like Jekyll and Hyde or the Hulk, where most of the stories you become a ravenous beast and don't have control. I'm curious, in the ancient world, were there stories? Did you run into any stories where the people intentionally became wolves? I mean, obviously the metamorphosis one sounds like it might be that's the case, but it's a little unclear.
It is. There's a really cool tradition that sort of almost spans from the Lycaon story. So the region that he was a king in Arcadia, is sort of treated in a lot of mythological sources and historical ones as the original place in which the Greeks were, this sort of almost like indigenous area of Greece. The oldest sort of kingdoms come from here. And I think because of that and because of that link, there was this really cool cult dedicated to Zeus Lycaos, so wolf Zeus, effectively, in this region where they believed Zeus was birthed in these caves and sort of grown up in these caves. And there was a really extensive cult that had all these really cool practices, the Arcadian cult. And they in particular developed these sort of rituals and stories about werewolf transformation for the members of this group. It's spoken about in a couple of different sources, and a few have some different details to provide, and sometimes conflicting details, which is the way. But a lot of the sources tell us that the ritual as it proceeded was a young boy, usually an adolescent boy, was chosen by lot from all of the families that were involved in this worship, in this cult. And he would be taken to a lake where he would shed his clothes and swim across the lake and then transform into a wolf that he would have to live as a wolf for anywhere between, I think it's 7 and 10 years. They don't give us specific numbers or corresponding numbers at least. And he would so go and live his life as this wolf. And then when he was done with his initiation rite, he would come back to the lake and he would swim back across the lake and he would pick up the clothes that he had hung on a tree and they would still be there. And he would transform back into a human being, but with the age that he spent as a wolf, the years he spent added to his age and to his appearance. And that was the big initiation rite for this specific cult, rather. So this was, I think, one of the only instances that we can sort of point to in antiquity in which this is an active choice to be made by the person who is transforming.
Yeah, neat.
It seems to me, I don't know how much you know about medieval history and mythology, but it seems like that story's played out a lot by the Middle Ages in kind of French stories and English stories about werewolves. It seems to be a similar kind of story.
It does feel like those elements get carried forward.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you know this, but from all of your research, do you get a feel for how the average person felt about werewolves in these times, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome? How did they feel about werewolves?
Actually, yeah, it's there's a couple of different threads that come together, and I think it really speaks to how many different genres of writing are including these sorts of myths and like folk tales and stuff like that. Is that we almost start to see sort of like more domestic narrative coming through in a lot of the later texts, especially. They talk about this specific term, and it's used as an invective. And I'm probably going to mispronounce this. I think it is Versipellis. It's certainly how I've been pronouncing it. Goodness knows the Australian accent. That'll do.
What does it mean?
It means skin changer. And the fantastic thing about this is it's associated with a couple of different werewolf figures and talked about in reference to or in relation to werewolf transformations. But a lot of the time it's being used as an invective to sort of mean like two-faced or someone to not be trusted because they change their skin. And it's so connected to this mythology that it would make us think that this implication that someone is a werewolf or someone transforms into a werewolf means that they're not to be trusted. And that's something we did get from Pomponius Petronius is Satyricon. That was a part of the story right at the end. He has a little line that says, and I knew now that this soldier was a werewolf and I could never sit down to a meal with him again ever because he was evil. And it's this intrinsic belief that these people are terrible people because the transformation indicates that's what they are.
It's me of the god Janus.
I was just thinking that. Yeah.
But it's funny because Janus is like, he's two-faced, but he's also the god of entrances, and like, so I don't think he's universally negative, but the whole Janus now being two-faced, two-faced now for sure. So did your research take you into any sort of post-Roman Empire era?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did. For some reason, I thought it would be a very interesting thing to go through a whole bunch of French philosophy, because everybody knows how easy French philosophy is.
Dozens of people have followed that path, so.
Absolutely.
At least, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. And I sort of found my way to a bunch of contemporary werewolf stories and adaptations and sort of stuff like that. And what I was finding, in part, I think because I skipped over a lot of this medieval era material on werewolves, because I knew how connected it ended up being to that witchcraft and like witch trials and all of that sort of stuff. And it ended up sort of not necessarily corrupting, but maybe changing the narrative quite a bit. And it's not what I really wanted to focus on. So I jumped all the way into the modern era. And I was finding all of these examples of werewolf stories that almost mimicked the context or the themes of the stuff I was reading in the ancient world. And it was the coolest thing to be able to go through and just, I was a huge fan of, this might be a bit embarrassing, but I love it so much, the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie.
Oh, cool.
It is a fun ride, but you're the first person I think I've talked to who's also liked it. So, yeah.
I adore it so much. It's so awful and it's so beautiful. And I think I can appreciate it so much.
I love their Patchwork Man, too. Yeah, absolutely. Their sort of Frankenstein character, too. A lot of fun.
They just throw so many different creatures and monsters right in there with no concern about the fact that those are completely different historical eras.
Yep, exactly. It's just put it in the blender and see what it tastes like.
Yeah. Here's Dracula just for fun, and it's so good. But the werewolf transformation in that film, it's actually one of the things that convinced me to go on this big, huge nonsense right into a PhD. Because in that specific narrative, the werewolf tears the skin of the human off and reveals the wolf underneath.
Yes.
Really, it's a really cool, for its time, it's such a fantastic CGI example.
Yes.
It was such a cool thing for me to see growing up, especially, like all of this sort of monster obsession that I had as a child, and to see it sort of depicted that way. And it started me on this really interesting journey through some contemporary examples to try and see all the ways that we've shown the werewolf transforming in a really physical sense. And Van Helsing did it so well. That tearing of the skin off and the crawling up the walls. And all I could think was, does that mean that they have a limited life cycle? Is there a certain number of moments that they get to tear that skin off? And eventually it'll run out and they don't transform anymore. And I wanted to know more about the structure around something like that. because that sort of like infinite movement, the back and forth, and the implication that there's no two sides to the creature, there's no two sides to the werewolf. It is one whole thing that is like full and complete within itself, was something that I really wanted to delve into, because it felt so much more true to the ancient material than anything I'd sort of seen before. And that led me right through. So I talked about the MTV adaptation of Teen Wolf, the TV series.
Wow.
Which is fantastic example of how morality gets folded into the werewolf narrative so often.
I never watched that because I got old, but
There's no excuse.
It is delightful. It's such a cool, almost closed bracket to the ancient stories of Lycaon, the way that they sort of manipulate morality and authority, and their idea of the true alpha, which is the alpha that can take power without needing to kill for it. It was such a cool, almost like superhero version of events that still referenced all the way back to the Lycaon mythology that they sort of used as their inheritance in the TV series. They talked about it.
See, you mentioned the Van Helsing movie. I would like to mention for our listeners, as a fan, Stephen Sommers was the director, and you would probably know him from The Mummy, the 99 Mummy with Brendan Fraser. But he also did a movie called Deep Rising, and if you like creature features, that one's really good. I'd say it's a treat, but since the hero is Treat Williams, rest in peace, that's too much of a pun even for me.
Well, and also talking about that movie, talking about the tearing off of the skin is kind of making me think of the Inquisition and the werewolf trials. So, Tanika, has your research taken you into the werewolf trials? I know that's a leap away from ancient Rome and Sumerians, but
so in a very sort of tangential way, I did, as a part of a PhD, one of the big things you do is a big literature review, and you go through and you find all of the little places where your sort of background information may lie. And I did a little bit of work in and around medieval uses of ancient texts to provide a sort of sense of authority to the sort of developing narratives, especially around the literature that was being published as a part of witch trials and this huge sort of call to identify creatures and identify witches especially. So there isn't a huge reference, but there is one small one in the big main witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, which is one texts, those big ones that sort of kick off quite a lot of the events that do occur. And there is one small one, but it's sort of filtered through a couple of different religious, like early religious Christian texts. So it doesn't necessarily follow, but there are a whole lot of, especially 16th century demonological texts. There's a couple written by, there's one, Reginald Scott writes one, The Discovery of Witchcraft, I think is the title for that one. And I want to say there's a king that writes specific demonological texts as well.
Yeah, it's King James, right? I think.
That's the one. So when I was going through and doing my literature review, I think it's in Reginald Scott's text where there's this really cool line that sort of draws back to the epic poets, to the Homeric texts, all the way back, some of the earliest sort of literary examples that we have. And one in particular was that people could turn into werewolves or could be transformed into werewolves because the witch Circe, who trapped Odysseus on his island, on her island rather, had all of these animals around her and could transform people into animals. And that was their sort of authority of transformation and how that sort of functions. So the ancient texts really did have a lot of influence on the way that people would believe, people would sort of create these medieval texts and this understanding of how it happened. The witch trials themselves, I know, are very, very focused, I think, on the connection between witchcraft and Satanism, which is a whole different area of inquiry, and how sort of like how witchcraft practices, and some of them inherited from the ancient Greek and Roman cultures, tended to interact with sort of introducing and sort of really strong Christian and Catholic developing sort of doctrines. And the werewolves that get caught up in that have a tendency to either be demonized by way of their connection to magic, which is something that happens quite often, or even potentially on the other side of that, saved by the fact that a lot of this was really, really very invested in women and femininity. So the fact that they were masculine figures can sometimes sort of shift that identification or accusation of witchcraft from them. So there are occasions in which there's a couple of accusations of werewolves in particular that did end in those sort of trials. It didn't happen very often, and it is sort of, once it does happen, it's only a very short period of time in which the trials are occurring and then they completely stop. And it does have quite a few interactions with the area of inquiry concerned with feral children as well. So the kids that sort of get caught up in or running away, I guess, from parents, from growing up in these like wilderness contexts and stuff like that, and trying to be reintegrated into society.
Yeah, the Raised by Wolves Mowgli kind of storyline, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a surprising amount of crossover there for the witchcraft trials and the werewolf trials.
That's really. We'll probably dive deeper into that topic soon, because it's anytime I run into something where I have a real hole in my knowledge, my first impulse is to fill it with lots of information. So
you mean wild children, feral children?
Well, I meant the werewolf trials versus the witch trials, but also yeah. The feral children thing I'm very interested in, largely because it seems like, much like we did some work on changelings in fairy lore, and it turns out that there's a pretty strong case to be made that a lot of the changeling stories are about autistic children or people going through dementia. So it's like a sort of a supernatural way to deal with real world problems or to explain them. And I'm curious about the werewolf trials versus the witch trials, because in my head, I see those as a masculine versus feminine thing, and I'm not sure that's really true. So I need to find out. I need to actually go back to the source material. But we have one more serious question before we get to our fun closer. And that is, and this is kind of a broad survey question, but in your research, it seems like some of these stories have a really strong moral component, but some of them seem more like accidents of fate. So did you find a lot of moral content in the mythology in the ancient world around these cases or these examples?
There was definitely a good amount of connection there between the werewolf stories that I was studying and that sort of moral, ethical kind of edge. I ended up, for my dissertation specifically, I sort of separated the ancient material into 4 different streams of sort of thematic inheritance that we like inevitably find, and it made it a lot easier to connect the ancient to the contemporary as well. So I talked about the developing humanist traditions, race and species, and then morality, and also individualism and multiplicity, and then magic and technology. And so those were my 4 sort of areas of inquiry, and the way that I sort of drove the research and could discuss the ancient texts specifically. And the moral one especially was absolutely such an embedded part of the ancient material that it was sort of drawn into those other examples. But it really did come through with Ovid in particular, that Lycaon story is so inherently connected to this sort of like moral obligation and the moral responsibility of a leader to their people, that was the contexts that we were seeing Lycaon come up in again and again. And the best part about that in particular was that I got to connect it all the way down to Stephen King and the werewolves he has in his particular brand of fiction, which is so often a really moral journey. There's this implication that by way of I don't want to quote Spider-Man, but it's almost Spider-Man. It's the with great power comes great responsibility, and it seems to be that's the inheritance of the moral story from the werewolf stories of ancient Greece and Rome. It's this real insistence that with that sort of power and with that sort of like physical and and in a sort of metaphorical sense as a leader, that there needs to be more responsibility, or it turns you into this like monstrous creature.
Yeah. The story of Lycaon reminds me a little bit of King Saul and David, where he sort of he turns into a beast, but it describes him as being more of a herbivore, so it's not quite the same. But yeah, that's really interesting.
There's an interesting comparison made in a couple of ancient texts, King Lycaon to the first king of Athens. And I do not know how to pronounce his name. I'm not going to try. I'll butcher it properly. But this Athenian king was the one that helped his people and fed his people and stuff like that. And the comparison that's made is while this Athenian king was taking that responsibility, Lycaon brought the body of a child to the altar for worship, and sacrificed the child, sort of thing. So it's a really common theme, this idea that you're not protecting the people who are under your protection. It's really, really deeply embedded.
Well, in so many ancient stories, the rules of hospitality being violated just bring down the god's wrath upon those who do it. And it's really interesting because, if it was a really tough time to survive. There wasn't a safety net.
Indeed.
And it's like, if you didn't give people hospitality or support them, moral condemnation from your peers is one thing, but it's like, it's so satisfying to know that the gods will smite you if you don't. That's way better, right?
Well, Tanika, it's just been fantastic to chat with you.
For real.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, but we've got one final question that we like to ask our first-time guests, and that is, what's your favorite monster?
My favorite monster? Oh, it would be so easy for me to say werewolves in this instance. It would be very, very easy for me to say it. But I have to be honest, a lot of the work that I've done around monstrosity and humanity and the connection between those two means that there's one figure in particular that sort of is my absolute all-time favorite creature. And her name is Erichtho. She's actually a Roman witch, a fictional Roman witch that comes up in an epic called Pharsalia, written by Lucan. And it's sort of this fictional retelling of the historical era of civil war in Rome between Caesar and Pompey. And she is this absolutely horrifying creature, this witch figure who prowls battlefields and collects pieces of corpses to perform her magic so she can see the future. Ooh. And she's so incredibly terrifying that when she speaks, the gods give her whatever she wants because they're so scared of her.
Wow.
And she's so delightfully powerful and so horrifying that she's my absolute all-time favorite. She's just so cool.
That's neat.
That's a new one for the show.
Exactly. Definitely. But I love that because, that's a sort of dichotomy we've talked about so many times on the show. There's the witch as a human who does magic, which is, I guess, more the modern conception. But then there's the witch who's clearly some kind of a creature / monster, the Baba Yagas, these sort of creatures. And that is so blurred throughout folklore and history. And I just, it's fascinating. I can't stop thinking about it. And, that's why we do this show. So there you go.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. It was really cool.
I'm here. This has been fantastic. I love a good chance to ramble about my area of expertise, and it's so exciting that it gets to be my area of expertise.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is the place.
Absolutely. If you manage to get a degree in doing so with monsters as the basis, you're definitely winning in my mind. So
yeah.
If people want to read your work, what's the best way to find it?
So a good old Google search is usually the best way. I have a couple of publications coming out, but I'm not too good at timelines in terms of stuff like that. But my work in particular, my thesis, can be found on just on the web. The University of Newcastle, Australia, has a good online repository that has a digital copy of my thesis there too.
Excellent.
For anybody who's willing to brave the madness, all of that.
And
there will be people.
I'll see if I can get a link straight to it or real close to it, and I'll put a link to your article at the conversation as well. Those were great.
Monster Dog.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard an interview with Dr. Tanika Koosmen discussing her research into the history of ancient werewolves. You can find links to her research and to the books and movies that we mentioned by checking the show notes that accompany this episode. And remember, you can always search up past episodes easily over at monstertalk.org, where there's a full archive of all our content. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Monster Talk. Each episode, we strive to bring you the very best in monster-related content with a focus on bringing scientific skepticism into the conversation. If you enjoy Monster Talk, we now have a variety of ways to support the show, all with convenient links at monstertalk.org/support. That's monstertalk.org/support. We have links there to our Patreon page as well as a donation button. Another great way to support the show is to buy books from our Amazon Monster Talk wish list, which directly helps us with our research. We love used books very much, so don't feel compelled to buy new ones, and we love Kindle so we can share our digital libraries with each other. And finally, without spending any money at all, you can support us by leaving a positive review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Positive reviews help keep us visible in iTunes, which is a great way to help us find new listeners. And please share our show on your favorite social media platforms. Monster Talk's theme music is by Pete Stealing Monkeys, and you can trust us to be your companion when you have to walk past the cemetery to get to your lover's house. We may not shut up the whole time, but we definitely will not turn into wolves.
This has been a Monster House presentation.